Hello, everyone. Good morning, or good afternoon, or probably good evening for you, wherever you are at this time. And first of all, thanks very much for the chairperson of the conference, Professor Horash Ahmedneya and Professor Roxana, for their kind invitation for the fourth International Conference of Contemporary Affairs in Architecture and Urbanism. Congratulations on such a great and successful conference in its fourth edition. And I'm sure that the success is going to be more and more in the coming years. Today, I will be presenting some reflections, some notes, or probably it's a way of thinking, reflecting from the urbanization process in the Mediterranean coastlines and in the Mediterranean region in general, but with special focus on the coastlines, with eventual reflections and notes on the challenges and potentials of the Egyptian planning experience, especially in the last 2 or 3 decades in particular. Well, speaking of the Mediterranean, always we have to introduce the importance and significant factors of the Mediterranean territory as a whole, which is represented by the strategic location between 3 continents, Asia, Africa, and Europe, which it was a very important hub in the ancient economies and cultures and societies and civilizations, especially with the Silk Roads and the ancient one and even the new one. Probably the focus in some parts and some sections of this presentation will be focused on the Eastern Mediterranean part of the Mediterranean territory, and doing such comparison sometimes between different cities on the other side of the Mediterranean. The Eastern Mediterranean part in particular has always played an important role in the transformation of the whole Mediterranean region. It also has served as an interface between the concerned cities and the regional, political, and social, and cultural, and of course, economic political visions. And this has always strengthened the link between cities among this region, not only by the coastline, because the coastline is only the interface, but even through the ports, the canals, the rivers, and the islands. One of the most underrated references in regards to the Mediterranean region is this wonderful book, Cities of the Mediterranean, which explains in a very smooth way some transitions occurred over time from the 18th, even from the ancient times to the 18th, and then 20th, and even today's cities and the transition of the urban areas and the different roles of some important cities of the region, where many ports, such as the port of Alexandria, the port of Damietta, Rosetta, they were very important ports of the earlier settlements, which could not really cope with the increasing demands, especially speaking about economics and political challenges of the region. Therefore, some great cities were the new focus for trading activities, especially in the post-industrial era, such as Istanbul, as we see in front of us, such as Istanbul, Cairo, Beirut, and of course, Izmir. And these cities were the biggest beneficiary cities of the transformation, as well as the land of Levant, of course, which probably will not have a big role in this presentation, but I found it important to highlight it, where the cities witnessed a prime increase in the number of ports, especially in the eastern Mediterranean coast in the 19th and 20th century, and therefore better economic activities due to the expansion of European Mediterranean cities' trade. However, in the last few decades, the Mediterranean region in particular has experienced almost no urban expansion. Speaking of the coastal line, of course, the declination of population rates is either due to the decentralization of economic activities or the centralization of population in hinterlands. This is because trading routes shifted from the sea to the land. And of course, this is obvious when we see that the major capitals, such as Cairo, is dominating the trading activities, the economic situations and conditions of the region, and therefore hinterlands are more significant in terms of activities, economic and social activities, and political, of course, domination in the region. Well, let's have some reflections and to understand the situation and how we arrived to such important conclusion, and probably to go back to the ancient cities and try to understand how these cities actually were configured in this region, especially on the coastal regions. And in front of us, of course, one of the most known cities or models, planning models, by the father of urban planning. And in this case, we can see how um, the city is actually formed. We can see very regular, very interesting pattern, creating such important spaces in between. But probably this is not the most important thing there. Um, there were such a future vision in such planning models, which I will try to highlight in a very brief way. Looking at this such of cities, we always find such interesting buffer zones surrounding the city and linking to the coast. This buffer zone is, in fact, is not a vacant land. It's not disconnecting the city from the coast. It's actually the opposite. It's giving such important link to the city and freedom to the city to expand. Not only, it is acting as a very coherent way of linking the city and the water. So it is the cohesion between physical elements and the water of the physical settlement of the city and the water. And this is what we can see clearly even in other cities, such as Kyrenia city, the Roman city in Kyrenia, northern Cyprus, where more or less we can see similar situation where the fabric of the city is clear and how they were trying to connect to the water and also give the city some freedom to expand west and east. And this is very, very evident when we go, for example, to the Byzantine era afterwards to see how the city, this here is the old Roman settlement, which I presented in the previous slide. It was in this area, but later in the Byzantine time, the city expanded towards the western side of the castle, and we can see again such interesting space between the city, the settlement, let's say the town, and the water. And again, we can see more or less a similar situation and a similar urban morphologies or urban fabrics. If we go to Beirut in the map of Beirut in front of us in the 1909, we can see also again similar situation where there is this element which presents a cohesion, a social and physical cohesion between the city and the coastline, which back then in those times the coastline was actually represented by the port as the most important hub of the city. Again, we can see it in Smyrna. We can see how the city, and again, we have such important role for the shore of the city, connecting in a coherent way the city to the sea. And it's worth mentioning that in all these examples I presented until now, we almost see a very coherent situation and fabric, and also in terms of the growth and the link to the water. Therefore, we see no disconnection. We see that the port is always connected into the city, and hence to the water, and therefore to the um, um, external world, external other cities around the Mediterranean. This is why this is only a conceptual representation of these models. We can see how the port and city are formulated, where always we have the town, we have a port, and we have a spatial environment, which I would call probably it's the spaces between the building, which gives the freedom to the city to grow in a sustainable way, and also this very linear, interesting space between water and the town, which gives also again the link between the city and the water, the port, and the expansion in a linear way. Going to the northern coast of Egypt, and in this case Alexandria, in the 1890, we can see again a similar situation. And it's evident even to the viewer how the city was formed, and how this again buffer zone, um, which is a very interesting element of the city, let's say, to connect the port and give it um, even a stronger tie to the city, because it represents such space for people to interact, for people to even grow in a linear way along the coastline. And the city, therefore, the later, for the people who know Alexandria, they know that it's growing east and west, and even with a slower, probably a slower pace to the southern side. Reflecting now from these ideas on the territorial, on more of a territorial perspective, we can see how the settlements, they were actually expanding in a linear way on the coast due to this important and significant tides they created. And we can see even inland how they created such important um, connections through either transit or, in this case, railways, which acts as the link between the city and the port in most of the cases, if not all of them. And this was the real connection between water and hinterlands, and therefore external connections to other cities and regions, probably on other sides of the Mediterranean. So these railways were actually very important connections. And as a result of these two connections, probably here it's parallel connections which seem not to be connected, but in fact, as I said, the first connection was that the railway was always serving the port, and the other one is an introduction of a new element, which is in this case, for example, Suez Canal, which has never been possible to have such canal if these two parallel connections were not actually existing there. And even later, we can see how the cities have new cities were born, such as Ismailia, Suez City, and Port Said, and later Port Fuad, even on the other river bank or canal bank of the Suez. And as a result, there was a very strong connection to the hinterland. So the coast presented new ways of understanding growth and expansion of cities. It represented new ways of connecting these cities through a very tight connection between railways and ports. And this introduced such new elements, and in this case, this is the Suez Canal, and new cities were born, and subsequently there was such important links between the cities in hinterlands and the canal cities. Accordingly, if we try to um, understand the definition over time in different periods after different transitions, if we try to understand the connection between land and water, which is represented by the coastline, actually. The definition of coastal area in ancient cities and ancient history, it was a coast area. It was understood by the connection to water, which was directly related to port activities and trading between civilizations. And of course, the port function itself was acting as a function for trading or fortification with other cities at different regions um, of the Mediterranean. And accordingly, we can define it, even according to the Oxford Dictionary, as a place on the coast where ships may moor in shelter, especially when protected from rough water, bears, artificial structures, and so on. However, over time with human activities, this definition was transformed into more of a geomorphological conception, especially later with more complex structures of the cities, where new understanding of territorial, urban, and rural development was understood due to the more complex political and economic situations and uh, um, considerations. Therefore, the coastline, and represented in this case by the port function, the definition or the understanding of it has changed from being urban cross-continental element into being an integral passage, such as rivers and canals. This is to say that in our present day, even canals, even rivers, are understood as a territorial port. So a port function in the ancient cities was actually only an element connecting the city to the water. However, nowadays, there were, with the more complex situations and conditions of the world, cross-continental, we can see that these elements, such as in this case, for example, Suez Canal, is becoming a very significant and even more interesting structure than the port, and it acts as a territorial port even. So societies have developed adaptive strategies in response to the rapidly changing face of the coastal environment. Now, if we will go to focus a bit on the northern coast of the Mediterranean of Egypt, on the Mediterranean, on the southern Mediterranean coast, we can see so many cities. We can see some important cities, big cities such as Port Said, Damietta, Alexandria, and Marsa Matruh, which are um, the governmental area of it, or the government of it is quite large. And of course, we have such other smaller, probably smaller settlements. But as a result, there is such situation, there is such connection between these settlements and cities. And this tight connection is representing the relation or the connection between water and hinterland. So water is the international and external connection, and the hinterland attached to the coast is the local and international connection. And therefore, the coast is acting as an interface connecting external conditions or other regions, external regions, and also hinterlands of a particular country. With that, we can say that when we have better connections on the coast through more habitation, then we can say that this coastline is urbanized. In other words, when we have less habitation, it means that there is less connection And when we have less connection, the result is less habitation of the coastline. This is even witnessed nowadays. And if we zoom in even more to one particular region for around 60 to 70 kilometers long, from eastern Alexandria, Abu Qir city, and Itko and Rashid, we can also see similar situations. So if we go to Abu Qir, which is a very, let's say, unusual situation if we take it from a historic perspective, but it's a very normal situation if we take it from the situation and the condition that the Mediterranean coastline is witnessing nowadays. The area highlighted in blue is actually the residential development or the urbanized area, let's say, of the city, while the one in yellow is actually either the port here or some other governmental functions or military bases. And even on the other side here, it's a military base, and it's actually a buffer zone, meaning that it's disconnecting the city from the water because there is no connection whatsoever between these urbanized area and both sides, because it's not accessible. It's under the control of the government. And the only accessible part of the city to the water is actually this very short coast in this area. Looking at Itku, again, we have a similar situation. This is the urbanized area, which is more of probably an informal area. And this in yellow is the shore or the land connecting to the water, which has no connection whatsoever. And again, we have a similar situation as Abu Qir. And here again, in Rashid, we can see a similar situation where the city has no connection at all to the water. Well, if we look at the Suez again, and in this case, probably in general, is the Suez Canal. We look at different cities, Ismailia here, Suez here, Port Said in this area. We can understand different situation. This is Suez Canal. And probably the first thing we witnessed that the city is not really very well connected to the port, which is this one. And the city is even growing towards other side. But in fact, this is not it's not an interesting, it's not a way of understanding these kind of cities, because the whole Suez Canal is acting as a port for Suez City, or even for Ismailia, or even for Port Said. So the port understanding, of the port and the function of the port is in this case only limited to such activities, such small, let's say, activities related to the city, and it's only serving the country as a whole, not only the city. But of course, these cities were born based on the canal, and therefore the canal is the force or the element that is actually giving it life. It's revitalizing always all the coastline or the vacant lands along the canal. And of course, we can understand why this element is important for Egypt, because of the Silk Road, which is connecting the from China through different regions, even to the Mediterranean through the Suez Canal. And it become even more understandable why the new planning of Cairo, of Egypt, is going towards the Suez Canal. So if we look at this is New Cairo here, and there is the new capital is actually being built here, which will be ready in few months to relocate some important activities from Cairo to this area. And it's clear that it's going towards the canal. And this highlights the importance of the canal in this region. And even because, according to Bloomberg, 10% of the oil trade and 8% of the natural gas trade pass through the Suez Canal, mainly from the Gulf region. And the number speaks for itself. So we can understand why this region is very important. But the question here is how did this change the urban and rural structures? Let's look at the Mediterranean represented by 21 countries, and we can find that overall population is about 522 millions, with a total area of about 87,000 kilometer square. In front of us here, we can see the 21 countries. And this study was conducted over about 2 years to understand the different statistics of these countries and the cities, where over 2,000 cities along the coastline of the Mediterranean were studied. And this is here, I'm only presenting some conclusions and more conclusions, of course, to come out of these numbers. But I'm trying only to focus on particular points. Well, here in front of us in this table, we can see the country, we can see total population, we can see the total area of these countries, the population density of these countries, the coastline length of each country, as well as the number of utilized areas, or the number of cities or settlements which are above 500 inhabitants in these countries. Um, and here it's worth mentioning that these were not calculated based on the municipal border, which we will come to this point later, but it was actually calculated based on the real urbanized, utilized area. So each city around the coastline was actually done one by one to understand the utilized areas of each country. And more or less, we can debate even on the numbers, especially probably the debate is why 500 inhabitants, now why not more, why not less, but probably 500 is usually the number where such social layer appear and some trading or some economic activities appear. And therefore it was took as an average to calculate. And therefore, here it's becoming probably the most interesting or the most important column of this table. Well, taking this column on to the to highlight other aspects, we can understand here some other statistics, such as the coastline length in general. We can understand the coastline population, not the country population, only the coastline population in these cities, the municipal area, and the coastline densities, the percentage of the Mediterranean coast in each number. So, for example, 40% is only the utilized area, or the Mediterranean, or the percentage of the population the percentage of the coast on the Mediterranean of the country, and the percentage of coastline population, and again, the utilized area of the coastline per country. Well, probably here the most important number that, or conclusion that appears, is actually the percentage of utilized areas in these countries and the overall utilized area of the Mediterranean. And the number is 4.35% only. So the utilized area, the populated, utilized areas of the coastline of the Mediterranean is only more or less 4%, where about 95, 96% is not utilized. So a normal question might appear then, even from someone outside of the field. Why are we still talking about population crisis if we have very large vacant lands. And here, these numbers I presented in the table are only for the coastline with average offset of 7 or 8 kilometers from the coastline. So where is the population crisis? Well, let's look at the densities here even and understand the densities of the coastline of each country and the utilized area then of each country. And we can find that the lowest is in Egypt, Italy, and Croatia. And the highest, of course, is Monaco, because Monaco is a very small settlement, which is um, totally on the coast, so it's 100%. But the lowest numbers are in Egypt, Italy, and Croatia, with only 0.79% of utilized area of the coastline in Croatia, 1% in Italy, 1.48% in Egypt. What does this mean? Let's have a look even at the most populated cities of these three countries. In Italy, Rome, we can see how the city is actually disconnected totally from the water. We go to Croatia, the most populated is Split city, which again, we can see how the port functions is actually more or less not connected well to the new development of the city, and there is no coherent between the city and the port. And even if we look at Alexandria, we witness the same situation where the port and the development in the city is actually neglecting the port. And in some cases, even we can see that it's neglecting the water. Well, if we look at the population of these three cities and the densities and the compactness, we can understand other things, which we will come to in a minute. Well, let's look at the other side, the opposite, the most utilized areas of coastline in the countries. And here we see Cyprus with 17.21%, France with about 19%, Spain is 17%, and Monaco, as I mentioned earlier, 17%. But in this case, we will exclude Monaco and Cyprus because they are islands. Because Monaco is actually all on the coast, and because Cyprus is an island, so it makes more sense to have high numbers. But the highest numbers here are France and Spain, relatively highest numbers, but it is still low numbers because it's 19% and 17%. But in fact, even these the highest numbers, we can look at the percentage of the Mediterranean coast of these countries, and we find that the percentage of the Mediterranean coast in France is only 18% of the overall coast, and in Spain is 33% of the overall coast. This is Monaco, just to show how the city, the city is actually totally compacted here and connected well to the coast. Meanwhile, Barcelona, we can see how the city, mainly the main density is actually in this side, and it's totally neglecting the port, or let's say there is no tight connection. In other words, there's no tight connection between the city and the port. And of course, if we look at the most populated area or city of coastal city of France, we can see that Marseille also is developing in a very, very rapid way away, and it's not well connected to the port, at least from a physical perspective. So now if we put all these numbers together, Rome, Split, Alexandria, population density, compactness, and we add another column, in this case, the utilized area, and then the most utilized areas, Barcelona and Marseille, we can come with such conclusions. Probably it's debatable, but when we have highest population with lowest density and even more compactness, we will have less utilized areas of the coastline in the country. When we have less population more density and even more or less similar within the average compactness, we will have more utilized areas. So here we highlight three problems. The first one, the Mediterranean density and compactness of the city is a real problem, and we can see clearly in this diagram here where France, the utilized area is 19% with 18% only of the Mediterranean, on the Mediterranean. Spain as well, 17%, where 33% is only a Mediterranean coast. And the other problem is that the problem is not only on coastline urbanization, but also on the port-city relation. And if we go even to have a look at another city, for example, Valencia, we can see how the rhythmic growth of the city, let's say, how the city is growing and expanding, and how the city is formed in this case, and even the streets, the connections, the highways, and the connections to the outside of the city, and the relation to the port. We can see almost no coherent connection between the city and the port, similar to the situation of Janaba, where port cities are not anymore port cities. They are ports and cities. We don't really see a typical port city as we used to see in the ancient times. Of course, we understand that there are more complexities in our present day, but this situation is witnessed even in Izmir, which is one of the most populated areas in Turkey, and the port. And even if we want to have a look at one city in Cyprus as an island, as a model representing islands, and in this case, the southern coast of Cyprus, looking at Limassol, we can see how the new port is actually disconnected from the main activities and growth of the city. And the third problem, which I briefly mentioned earlier, is the municipal borders. In fact, all the numbers done in this study was focused on comparison of two calculations of borders. Once at a municipal border of the city, and the other one as at the real utilized border of the city, where each city was, as I mentioned, calculated based on the real utilized area. And in this case, we can see how this is a threat even for future researchers, if I may say, because usually we just look for statistics. What is the population or what is the density of such city? And we can, when there is a number, but these numbers are really not accurate, are not true. And basically because usually the border of the city, the governmental or the municipal border of the city is much wider, much bigger than the real utilized area of the city. And sometimes because of some geographical conditions, sometimes because of a difficulty of providing connections, and for so many reasons. In here, if we look at, again, this diagram, but in this case, we look at the compactness of the cities, and which refers even to how the city is compacted, where the number of utilized area over the real number of the city. We can see that when we have less area of the city, we have more utilized area of the coastline. And this is reflecting again on the idea or on the factor, let's say, of the municipal border of the cities. So cities must be compacted in order to have a better utilized area. If we conclude probably with two sentences, we can say that with more compactness and less densities, we have less connection to the coastline. With less port-city relation, we have less mobility among coastal and hinterlands. Well, if we try even to find such average of the overall coastline density, which is in this case on all the Mediterranean countries about 556, and then we try to find the average sustainable density rate that cities must adapt in order to cope with this crisis, we come up with, of course, taking into consideration the length of each coast and the number of areas inhabited on the coast of each country, we come up with these numbers, which theoretically present sustainable density rates. These cities and these countries must, or these cities, all of them in each country must adapt. But really a question remain in this case, because densities must be evaluated on coastline, not cities only. And therefore, it was calculated even on the coastline, and we can understand here that to achieve a sustainable density rate in Egypt, we need around 14,715 the ratio of the density to be on the coastline. And of course, these numbers for each country. Well, now going back to Egypt to have more focused vision, where the utilized area is 1.48% and the overall percentage of the Mediterranean coast is 40%, we can understand that density, therefore, is not the problem. Well, compactness is the problem in this region. Therefore, the problem is within the distribution of the population, not really the density of population within each city. And even looking at this interesting diagram or map in front of us, showing us the new satellite cities of Egypt, we can see only one city, New Damietta, located on the coastal line, whereas all other cities, as you can see, it's actually in the hinterland. And these cities, more or less, actually, to be fair, the new capital of Egypt, the new administrative capital of Egypt, is actually following a successful development, territorial development strategy due to the clear connection to the Suez Canal. But this is not enough because we need to utilize some more coastal areas. Looking at Port Said in this case, for example, we can see that yes, Port Said is very well connected to the canal, but it actually has no connection to the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean Sea is actually here on the northern side, and there is no connection at all because of some resorts, because of some physical barriers such as walls, walled compounds, walled buildings, and there is no connection at all to the water. Meanwhile, if we look at only the opposite side, this is Port Said and this is Port Fuad, only the opposite side of the Suez, we can see this is a relatively more recent city. We can see more and better connection between the city and the port as only port element or port function, and even the territorial port, which is in this case the Suez Canal. And most interesting, we can see the buffer zone between the city and the water, which we have seen in the old settlements. Suez City, again, represent another probably well-connected city to the canal. Not only because it's on this side, because it's growing north and east towards the canal, which might have more utilized areas along this area in future. In front of us, again, representing a canal, in this case, Corinth Canal in Greece. We can see even as how the canal is acting as a territorial port, connecting the eastern part of the Mediterranean to the western part of the Mediterranean through Greek islands. However, the urbanization process in the last decades has failed to preserve some elements. For example, here, yes, we mentioned that that the Ismailia city or the capital of Cairo is more or less connecting now, stretching towards the canal and to Ismailia and so on. But the element, this territorial element in front of us, highlighted in orange, which is the Ismailia Canal, is losing its prestige because it's actually disappearing because of urbanization process in Cairo. So here the question is how to preserve the connection to the sea while the canal and the rivers while the canal is dominating the development and it's killing, for example, the rivers, other canals and land and so on. To understand this, we need to understand the other side of the coin. Of course, we have some reflections in the urban situation, but rural areas are also very significant to understand to have more coherent and more comprehensive vision. If we look at the urban population in the Mediterranean in general, we can see that the urban situation, the urban development is always declining in front of the urban areas. If we look at some statistics here in front of us in Barcelona, we can see that the employment sector by the employees by economic sector, we can see the agriculture in Barcelona 0 while industry 7.4, construction 2.7, services 89.9. And again, if we go to the Nile Delta in Egypt, where we have above 20% of the overall population is located in this land, we can find that it's contributing. This area is contributing, agriculture and rural, and this area in particular is contributing with about 11.3% of the Egyptian GDP. Meanwhile, the Suez Canal is contributing with about 12%. This means that, yes, the canal is important. It's a very significant structure, economic structure to the country, but let's not forget about the rural and agricultural lands. Let's not forget about the identity even of these areas, because if we see 50, this is about 40 years ago. This map on the left is from the 80s, 1980s, and this is more recent, about around 2020. We can see how the agricultural lands are disappearing from around Cairo. And this, of course, indicates to us clearly how the urbanization, how the urban areas are actually going more and more, although agricultural lands are actually in Egypt are actually increasing. What does this mean? If we have urban areas are going with higher rates than rural, and the rural is declining. Meanwhile, agricultural lands of Egypt are actually increasing. This means that urban population is increasing in a faster rate than the agricultural lands, and eventually a sudden shock is expected to occur with sudden and sharp declination of rural agricultural lands in Egypt. Well, Again, if we have a look at the statistics in front of us, where the urban income in Egypt, the urban income per capita is 67% more than the rural income. And as rural is increasing, a balance is needed at the level of planning new urban communities. And this also highlights the urban encroachment on agricultural lands. Well, if we have large agricultural lands and the lands are actually increasing, meanwhile, the cities and the new communities, the urban communities are increasing in a faster pace, it means that urban is actually killing the agriculture. And it's even, we can see here how so many Nile channels were abandoned and also being abandoned nowadays. And now going back even to these three cities on the northern coast that I presented, in this case, Itko, we can see that the city and the water were disconnected, probably because of a physical barrier, which is, in this case, the highway. And again, in Abu Ir, it's the same situation, the highway. And again, in Rashid, it's the same situation, the highway. Meanwhile, in the ancient time, the highway or the railway was actually the way to connect the city to the port and hence to the water. And this is the situation. This is the red one is actually the highway, which is connecting the three cities eventually, but it's disconnecting the cities from the water. And therefore, as a result, consequently, it's disconnecting the cities from one another. And this here in front of us is actually um, the another reason for the encroachment on agricultural lands is actually because of the railway, where the hubs and the stations of the railways are located in a very disconnected situation with the port of the city. In Abu Qir, it's here, and we have seen how the city is actually disconnected from the port and hence the water, and therefore even the railway, the main station is disconnected. Here also on Itko, the main station is here. Meanwhile, the city is disconnected from the water, and again, Rashid is a similar situation. So the port-city relation and the hinterland port relation is actually um, in threat. Well, these port city models are not actually accurate nowadays. This is the real model if we want to simplify it, the port and the city, and there is this connection between them. We mentioned about in earlier slides how with more compactness, less densities, we have less connection to ports. With this port-city relation, we have less mobility among coastal and hinterlands. And even now, we can say that with less rural development equals to less connection to the coast, which equals to less economic domestic income. So population growth is not really the real problem here. Densities, distribution of population, planning, and integration of different models is the real problem. Therefore, population here should should not be the focal point in our future researches. Rather, the distribution of the population is actually the most significant part to highlight. Rural is not versus urban. Rural and urban should work together in integrated vision with port, canal, cities model forward to achieve the revitalization and regeneration of port-city relation, and of course, on the other side, the rehabilitation and generation of hinterlands and canal relation. And this is to say that new communities should not be rural. New communities should not be urban. Rather, we should have new urban communities. new rural and urban integrated communities in our local planning. And this, one of the factors, which is probably will be shocking even, is to increase the population in our countries. And we have a very important, and we have actually an existing um, factor, which is migration due to social, political situations in other countries, in some countries. Well, let's use this to inhabit our areas. And this is to simplify it on how these models could even work. Well, looking at a more historical context, we can see how the land and water were always connected. Meanwhile, in the contemporary context, we can see how the um, city is actually disconnected from the water, and therefore the solution is through the integration between the cities and the water through hinterland polycenters, which is based on rural integrated urban models, always with eventual connection to the coast and the hinterlands. And as a result, all the Mediterranean coastal areas will be connected. And this then would work on all the coastal areas of the Mediterranean, for example, the northern coast of Egypt with the different cities growing towards new centers, and of course the railway, a new railway connecting these cities, and then connecting even to the inside of to the hinterlands and to the Cairo and more populated and more important cities inland in each country could adapt this model to achieve more of a sustainable density model along the coastal lines or the coastal line of the Mediterranean, and the territorial port, in this case, the Suez Canal, the Corinth Canal, and more canals, and probably more rivers even would be integrated with a territorial perspective to um, reach a successful model um, and on the whole Mediterranean. And then, as a result, all the cities around the Mediterranean would be probably connected in a way or another within a territorial model, taking into consideration the ancient models, the new models, urban areas, population, and of course, as the main conclusion of this presentation, that population is not the problem, the distribution is the real problem in our regions, and the solution is through urbanizing the coastline of the Mediterranean through integrated urban and rural model of each country. Thank you very much for listening. In front of you, you have my information. I'm always ready to answer any questions, to discuss or debate any points, even to develop any statistics, any points of debate, any way of thinking you think would enrich this study. I'm always welcoming that and looking forward always for successful, even future collaborations among us. Please don't hesitate to contact me. Have a good day, and thank you again for this wonderful conference, and congratulations on its success.